Got it.
Okay, so yeah, and we can get started. And if you don't mind, we can start with recapping a little bit about what you discussed last time and on your topic, which is clinical community.
Yes, it was about need for balance. Right.
Yeah.
So my name is John Moritsugu, and last time around we talked a little bit about my background. My PhD is in clinical psychology with community orientation. I went to school at University of Rochester in New York. I'm presently a professor emeritus at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington. I've held a variety of different positions in professional psychology organizations. Been a co-president of Division 45, president of Division 27. I've been president of Washington State Psychological Association. I've been on APA Council for Divisions for Division 27 and for Washington State. And held a variety of different positions during my time. What else? So last week we were talking just generally about balance and the need for balance. And I talked about how I see being a psychologist, an active psychologist, as being more of a marathon as opposed to a sprint. And so toward that end, there needs to be a kind of balance in your life. Otherwise, it's easy to burn out. So toward that end, in terms of balance, it's helpful to keep perspective with regards to our life and what we want from it, and why we're psychologists. We make a variety of choices within our lives, and that seems to be important. I think I mentioned that when I'm at professional meetings, I usually make sure to get out somewhere during the daytime or even in the evening, so that I get a breath of fresh air and help compose myself and get some sense that there are things outside of the meetings I'm in that are important. Let's see. I think I did mention that the research in psychology suggests that perspective taking is very important in thinking from multiple viewpoints are important, and that's helpful when you give yourself the opportunity to step back from things. I think that's generally it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you for giving me the summary of the last time.
Sure. Sure.
And I was looking at your title of the session. Initially, you also put down clinical community psychology pathways, and I was curious about that because I am in counseling psychology program at Indiana University, and I don't think we have a concentration on clinical community work, and I've heard a little bit about that. So I was curious about kind of from your perspective, what is there to know about clinical community work?
Right, or counseling community work. Very good. the balance, I see balance is important, not just in terms of our professional life, but also in terms of the kind of work we do. I think most of us get into what we're doing now, studying counseling or clinical, because of an interest in our communities. And lots of times that can get lost in our focus on more individual kinds of issues. So my understanding is that there is a strong component in counseling with regards to communities, working in communities, and with regards to prevention in particular. And that's also a community kind of focus. So rather than wait for pathology to arise, for people to walk in our door, there also needs to be outreach and work in the larger community to try to see how systems can be changed or programs can be adopted that would better help the community at large. And I guess along those lines, I see it as a kind of balance between our individual focus in clinical or counseling and in the larger community. In a way, it goes back to, I think, my reason, and I think maybe your reason for getting into it, and that is to help our communities. Yeah. How's that? Okay?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about being kind of being your parents are immigrants and you're coming from Hawaii and all over the place. And I wonder, what are some challenges for you as a faculty, or even go back when you were a doctoral student, a minority faculty or minority doctoral student? What are some challenges for you in terms of work-life balance and also the work that you do?
Right. A very good question. In that, I think this has been talked about elsewhere and written about elsewhere, that there are multiple polls on this, and maybe more polls on ethnic minority faculty than on others, because you're seen to represent our communities, maybe multiple communities, and so we might get assignments or requests for membership in committees or activities in the larger community that are extraordinary. And so toward that, and there are two things in particular I found very helpful. One is to get, and we talked about this last week, one is to have some good mentors, people who have been around, know the systems, both in the university and outside the university, so they can help us make some decisions with regards to how we take assignments and what assignments we take. So I like to think that my typical answer is yes. And so I found my career advanced as a result of being able to say yes to multiple requests from folks I may or may not have known. But at the same time, no is also a legitimate answer and something that we need to be able to do. So in some of my positions, I have gone out asking people to participate, and sometimes it's yes, and that's great, and sometimes it's no, and that's very understandable. And we have to be able to allow ourselves to have boundaries and limits on our time, and otherwise to understand what it's necessary to survive in our systems. It does nobody any good if I can't get ahead in my university or my school or my community. So the mentors should be able to help me figure some of that out, but also my own empowerment, my taking sort of agency in being able to say yes and no at the right times. And maybe given um, my own thinking with regards to purpose and goals for myself as an individual professional, but also taking the perspective from others, my mentors in the larger community. There has been some research I found very interesting that looked at what's called agency versus communion in terms of looking at priorities for what we do. And the agency is an individual focused, getting ahead kind of thing. So we need to survive individually. We need to get ahead individually. And the communion is really a consideration of others in our world. And many times we set it up as an either or. You know, I either help myself and focus on my career, or I help my community, focus on their well-being. And there is some research out there, some fairly new research suggesting they should be seen as interdependent. And so it's nice where you can both act as agent, helping yourself, but at the same time, helping your community. And they, in this research, they found that the best leaders did that, both agentic as well as community oriented. And that's a kind of balance of sorts. I thought that was very interesting, especially as you think in terms of the kinds of push and pulls we have on this. That's right. Well, in other times, there is, I think, especially a need to be aware of the systems we're in and the folks we associate with. And that's why I see Division 45 to be important, your Asian AAPA to be important, so that we help to build our own communities that will help support us and provide the kind of information and advice that might help us in making these distinctions and working toward this balance. Right.
Yeah.
I've had lots of mentors, I'll say.
Right. Wow, that's really helpful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
And, yeah, and I like when you said kind of you can both advance your own career and also help your community at the same time. It doesn't have to be either.
Yes.
And I can see when working for the community is also energizing for us as psychologists to kind of advance our own career.
Right, yes. And sort of is a good way to help us stay in touch with our original choices with regards to goals and purpose in life. And I see those as very important.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And as you were talking, I was thinking about my own experiences, kind of helping with the community that I identify with. And obviously, I work with the community around my university.
Right.
That is a college population. And at the same time, I also work with Asian international students or Chinese international students, provide counseling and Mandarin, and seeing some students from similar backgrounds as me. So I was thinking about that, and that kind of comes with some kind of successes and challenges. I think the challenges are as I was providing treatment to individuals from China or from Asian culture, they are not as knowledgeable as American students in terms of what is counseling and what can treatment help me, or what is the expectation. So there is a lot of kind of education going on in terms of treatment. And also outreach is a little difficult. We've done a lot of outreach to get clients in the room. We know there is this need, but it's been sometimes very difficult to have the buy-in because mental health is such a stigmatized topic among Chinese community. I find it pretty challenging in terms of, helping them to understand that this is helpful or this is needed.
Right. And there is also some pretty new research looking at outcomes, and I was struck with how one of the most important factors seemed to be involvement in the community as a good determinant with regards to leader assessment on satisfaction, and that really engagement in the community, being a part of the community in some ways, helps to ease that kind of transition. We aren't folks sort of distant and off and studying mainstream theories and mainstream practices. We're also very much aware about what is going on within that community and what is important or not important to them. And there is sort of striking the balance of being familiar enough, but also having sufficient boundaries. I think that's always something of an issue. But again, the involvement in the community seemed to be really important. And then there are also different ways in which Asians, in particular, might look for help in that there may be differences with regards to what their immediate goals are, more sort of calming, reassurance kind of thing, versus getting into primal emotions to begin with, might be different for various groups. And there is some work that's suggesting that as well. So it is,
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for the information. And could you talk a little bit more about the communities? You talked about community work, and I was wondering, what are some communities that you've worked for before, either from a practice standpoint or from a research standpoint? And I think our students might be very interested in knowing the kind of work overall that you're interested in, that you have been doing.
Right. With regards to specific communities, I don't have permission to talk about my work with them. So I'm always a little reluctant to specify exactly which communities I've been in. And given our awareness and sensitivity to the rights of the communities we're in, I don't have that. I couldn't speak to them in particular.
Okay. I understand that. That's fine. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, sure, you're welcome. I am reminded, though, I'll say, of asking somebody in to talk about their work in a given community, And I thought it very interesting, the process they went through. They went back to their community, given the request, talked to them about whether or not it'd be okay, got them involved in the discussion about what would be talked about and how they might be identified. And once they had agreement from that community, they then brought some of that community along with them to talk about their work. And I thought it really very rich presentation where the community themselves could talk about what was going on, how they saw issues, and the community psychologist really facilitated that. It was more recently, but I liked that, and I thought that was a very nice way to go. I'll say that. I can say that.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And you mentioned the kind of the idea of community psychologist. I'm not very familiar with the concept.
Okay.
What do you think is different in terms of the job of, or the role of a community psychologist versus a clinical or counseling psychologist?
Okay, right. There are others who might address this slightly differently, so I'll acknowledge that. I do have a text in community psychology right now, so I'll say I'm referring to some extent to the newer refinements going into the next edition, so we're working on that. I'd say to begin with that my own sense of clinical, and I don't know counseling as well, so I'm more reticent to define what counseling does, but clinical has traditionally looked at individuals and their adjustment and their pathology. And so the focus has been, for the most part, on how the personality and habits and traits of the individual might influence their well-being or illness. Community, I think, was part of the movement, and it's really gained momentum. So clinical does it now, and my sense is counseling does as well. Was part of the movement to say we need to look at the contributions of the larger environment, i.e. community, to the development of well-being and illness. And so the model is not focused on the individual or the treatment of the individual so much as it is looking at the individual and their community and how the individual or the community, probably the community as well, should be addressed in dealing with any kinds of issues, first of all. And secondly, again, I know clinical and counseling are very much into prevention. Community was also part of that emphasis on prevention as an approach. So rather than, this is an old classification system, but rather than thinking in terms of tertiary interventions after the pathology is established, thinking more in terms of primary prevention. So dealing with, looking at communities and environments and thinking, how can this be a healthy one? And how can we foster that being a healthy one? So you see the focus is off of blaming the individual to looking at the person environment fit and how that fit might be made better, either on the part of the environment or on the part of the person,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, so that would be a community kind of approach that I'd say, right?
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And,
That sounds really exciting.
well, thank you. There are some review articles on prevention programs for children, and the data looks pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And there are otherwise
Yeah.
journals full of studies looking at systems and communities and how to work with them, what it may mean to redefine problems from that perspective.
Yeah.
But
Wow. Yeah.
yeah,
It sounds like the community work, the emphasis on the system and on the environment um, really aligns with social justice, kind of
yes,
the mission that psychology is heading towards in the past
yeah,
maybe few decades, in terms of, just like you said, redefining the problem, or it's not necessarily the individual that is the problem, but maybe the
right,
community or the system that is perpetuating the problem.
right, and you're right. And so social justice is a big topic now. Again, has been around for a long time. And the assumptions of social justice are that a socially just society is a healthier one as a whole. So, right,
Right,
right.
right,
So
yeah,
there would be interest in promotion of
yeah,
social justice
right,
in a variety of ways. Right.
yeah, yeah,
Mm. Uh,
yeah. And that makes me think about we've learned a lot about kind of social justice orientation, and as psychologists, there are things or work that we can get involved in to promote social justice and kind of fixing the system. And it sounds like that pretty much aligns with the concept of communities as psychologists working with
right.
our.
I think that's so. Um, the arguments for this in particular have come from um, folks like Pilatensky out of Miami, or Simona Garcia out of Puerto Rico, and Watts, I think, out of Georgia State, in particular for community psych. And there are others. I'm going to leave out plenty of folks, but there are others. I think who are especially interested in issues of social justice and how that works.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
right. Huh.
yeah. And I wonder how when psychologists are doing community work or working with the system, um, how much will will they be involved in policy change, or kind of making policy or changing the policy?
Yes. And so I'm not here to talk about Division 27 per se, which is community, but
Right.
there is a specific council on public policy that looks at public policies as they are arising nationally and locally, and position papers will be written and stances taken with regards to public policy. I also believe there's groups, there's at least a group I'm aware of in DC that tries to use science to inform decisions around public policy at the national level. Um, and of course, the larger organization like APA has a major role in public policy kinds of issues, and you could see some things going on there that are especially interesting. Um, such as things around Medicare, Medicaid, uh, because of health issues in particular, addressing specific populations, but also I think especially important with regards to training and funds for training new professionals and advocacy for those things as well. Right, right. And for prevention, the group I'm thinking of, in fact, in DC, sort of meets and talks about prevention and ways in which prevention can be embedded into our thinking. In fact, I'm pretty sure counseling has representatives there as well, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And thinking about kind of working with the communities or working with making some systematic change in the community, are there any kind of skills that were not really taught or learned in graduate school as psychologists? Or what are some maybe unique challenges kind of working in a larger scale rather than with individual clients?
Right, right. Oh, you ask all the right questions.
It just makes me very curious about the whole concept.
Yeah. There is a new text out on the practicum skills, and it follows the report that came out about a few years ago about the kinds of skills that would be ideal to have. Of course, the list is pretty long, but I think among the more interesting ones are in skills in building groups, in helping folks collaborate, in sort of getting bridges to be built and connections to be made within systems. Also in terms of public policy, how to move that along, ways in which that can be facilitated. And then you sort of alluded to it earlier in your own work in that psychoeducational efforts would be especially helpful. And so the idea of psychological intervention as education, I think, is important. I at one point had reflected on how intro psych is I guess the most popular course in all of college. It would be nice to embed in all intro psych courses, which would be a massive audience, some of the principles needed to live a healthy life. Toward that end, we do know that science is taught in intro, science of sorts is taught in intro, and now more and more the topic of stress is taught and studied. That's also very helpful. But there, the way of thinking of problems and health would also be a good thing to embed in those kinds of courses about not just the person, but the environment and the interactions of the two and how they bring about good outcomes. And maybe some examples of how early interventions seem to really help later on. In dealing with the ideas has always been if you deal with it early on, you may be able to have a larger impact on the individual over time. Yeah, I all of those things would be good skills, psychoeducation and in coordination, in systems building across agencies and within agencies, in particular. You know, it, um, and I guess it is a skill of sorts, but theoretically, think more along the lines of what would call ecological frames for conceptualizing the issues we're dealing with. The ecological frame being the person and the environment interacting with each other, and how that is important. And ecologically as well, that we need to think more in terms of longitudinal programs as opposed to one-shot kinds of programs, and maybe some medical model things that have gotten in the way. I am always struck that 3 or 4 sessions is just a small piece of an individual's larger ecological experience. And it'd be nice to be able to follow them longitudinally and have programs that allow for that. Yeah. Sorry, I take it those are the kinds of things you're looking for.
Yeah. Okay. Those are a lot of really good points and a lot of good information.
Right. I'm basically drawing on the work of Dalton, and I'm going to remember his name at a later point. But there's some articles out on this. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I could send you the reference.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
That would be really helpful, and I can put it up on our website as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
that's it. Walton and Wolf. Right.
Yeah. That is very helpful for students like me who are not necessarily familiar with the concept of community work and having kind of an expert snapshot of what are the main points out there, and what are some key readings, and I think that's a starting point for someone who like me.
Okay. And so I'll also maybe send the Serrano Garcia article out on social justice.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Right.
Good.
Right.
Yeah. And we have a few minutes left.
Okay.
And I maybe ask one last question, or maybe last few questions. I was thinking about what are some of the ways that students in counseling or clinical or psychology programs can be involved in the type of community work that you were talking about. As we do practicum, a lot of the practicum opportunities focus on treating individuals. And I feel like we don't have a lot of opportunities to expose to community work.
Right, I see. Well, again, my suggestion is that you make sure that you get your training and you get your degrees. So you want to make sure you're focused on what's necessary to succeed in what you're doing at the present time. If you were looking for opportunities to go out into the larger community and do other kinds of work, one thought, in a more general sense, is to think in non-traditional ways. So social groupings or clubs or might be a good site to go and find out what's going on, and there is more and more work now being done with regards to participatory work. So my own sense is social groups, maybe schools or after school programs might be places where you'll find groups of individuals that you'd like to learn more about or maybe help. Most folks are looking for, boys and girls clubs. There are lots of places where psychological expertise would be helpful, and there are opportunities for us to learn. It's really a two-way street. For us to learn as well about our communities, as well as maybe our communities to tap some of what we might be able to bring to the table. So I think non-traditional type settings. Something maybe is I just saw something on a cappella singing. Maybe if there are a cappella singing groups that are focused in certain ways, it might be an interesting entree into the community. My own, some of my own entrees were through community houses or particular programs that were going on. Recreational programs they can think in terms of what's happening not in the community, and go out there and explore what they are. It would be nice to have some support in that, but if you're interested in being in the community, go out and live in the community and find out what are some of the existing systems that are important to that community. That would be my sense of it. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it sounds like exploration and just find out what is out there and.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And opportunities come from that. I was just thinking when I was in graduate school, when you're talking about that, I belonged to an Asian American club of students, and at some point somebody asked me to teach a course on Asian Americans. I thought, this is a long time ago, but I said I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know there was a specialty. They said, "Oh yes, there is." And so we studied on it, and we got a course. Yeah.
Yeah, going along with these opportunities and kind
of. Right. Yeah. They see you and they think, maybe there's something. Right.
Yeah. And maybe going back to the topic that we were talking about earlier in terms of work-life balance, and thinking about as a psychologist who is involved with community work, it sounds like it might pose some unique challenges in terms of work-life balance, because sometimes we are a part of the community and we work with the community as well.
Right.
And earlier you talked about being able to say yes and no, and being able to set up some boundaries. And I wonder if there are any other advice in terms of setting up work-life balance as a psychologist, especially if we're doing so much and you can always have unlimited opportunities.
Right. I guess it reminds me to be sure of your own priorities, and that for me, my family is number one priority, and so I build my life around that. And doesn't mean it has to be yours, but that's fine. And that meant decisions with regards to opportunities that might arise, and when I could say yes and when I could say no. So for me, doesn't mean it has to be for you, but for me, I would take on no more than one major professional office or role at a time. That was external to the university. And that seemed to be, we agreed, my family and I agreed to that ahead of time. I could do that. So, being, some committee member meant that I wouldn't take on another committee at some point. Or if somebody said, could you do this for us as well? I'd really have to consider, is this, should I break my rule for this in particular, or is this an extension of the role I'm in? And sometimes it led to yes, I could do this, and sometimes no. Come back and see me in a few years when I'm done with this, and I'm happy to. I'm interested and happy to be involved, but I just no. I want a family. I want a personal life. So one thing at a time, and again, in the same kind of way within the university, be prioritizing what I needed to be a viable member, to be a valued member within the university community or whatever, your clinic. So prioritize what I said yes to and no to, and how that all fit together. Right.
Wow. Yeah. And I think it's very reassuring to hear from a professor's standpoint that it is okay to prioritize and it is okay to do one thing at a time. And it sounds like it may also give you more time and resources to do the one thing well rather than taking on too many things and not doing them very well.
Yes. Yeah. I think as long as you can do that and survive, I understand there are times when you have multiple things to do, and we all have to get done. There's no getting around some of those times, but when you can,
right,
prioritize, right.
Yeah, and you also talked about sometimes you make agreement with your family ahead of time, and it sounds like there's communication in terms of being very transparent about what is on your plate and whether the family is okay with the commitment that you're making.
And that's helpful. It's very helpful because let's go back and talk about it again. If you want to do more than one, that everybody understands what that means. And there are times in your career where more than one might be appropriate, but for the most part, people understand that. I'm trying to think. I don't know anybody I talked to when I said no. Said, "Oh no, family is not worth that much." Right.
Yeah.
So, nobody argued with that. Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Moritsugu. And thank you for all the information on the clinical community work that you specialize in, and also the wisdom and advice you give on work-life balance. There's a lot of information, and I think it's really helpful for me personally. Really beneficial for our students to do later as well.
Good. Well, and thank you, intern, for being a part of this. I realize it is something extra for Division 40, your duties with 45. And I encourage you in this. I think it's a very nice project. I hope it's of value to others. And I can see you're on your way in a variety of ways. So good for you.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Yeah, I enjoy this opportunity because it gives me the opportunity to kind of go outside of my campus and with students nationally and professors
Good,
nationally,
right.
and hear different perspectives, because sometimes we are consumed in our own department.
Yes.
And hear the same. It's all good, but
Sure.
sometimes it's good to have some variety.
Right. Well, good. And so I'll say what I said last week, which is please feel free to contact me or be in touch. I do plan to be at this coming APA in San Francisco. So if you happen to be there, come up and introduce yourself. Be happy to continue this conversation.
Sounds great. Yeah, I will be in San Francisco, and
okay.
I'll encourage our students to come up and meet you as well.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And I see on the screen that there's a Holly Bachelor who's also on, and so thank you for being a part of this as well.